I couldn't help wondering if I had just completely lost my mind. This has happened more than once, of course, but I'm talking about one time in particular. I had a person strapped to my back, and a pack was on his. From where I was sitting, I could see the tandem couples ahead of me, each pair crouching by the door, then disappearing. This had seemed like a good idea at the time, but now I wasn't so sure, at least not from this elevation. I was about to go, can anybody guess? Skydiving. Yep. It was my freshman year of college. I think I had been in school for about 2 weeks, and a group of girls in my dorm were putting together a skydiving excursion. When I first raised the possibility with my parents, my mom was adamant. No way are you doing this. I reminded her that I was 18 and I could technically do whatever I wanted. She reminded me that I had not yet secured a job in Ohio and had in fact called to ask them for the $350 for the experience. You are not doing this, she said. I confess I was unsurprised. My mom was not a big risk taker, but I was disappointed. The next day, my phone rang and it was my dad. Now this was a bit unusual because while I chatted with my mom practically daily, Dad wasn't one for idle conversation. True to form, he was calling me for a reason. Jill, I never got a chance to go skydiving, and I always wanted to. If you really want to do this, I'll give you the money. So long story short, I did go skydiving, and momentary fears on the plane aside, it was an unbelievable experience. If I were independently wealthy, I absolutely would have made a hobby out of this. The falling part lasts only about a minute, but in that span you fall more than a mile a minute, and words just don't do justice to the thrill of it all. I actually have a video of the whole thing, so I'd be happy to share that with you sometime, though I confess there is more than one "oh my God" screamed at the top of my lungs, and perhaps even some other words as well. But I'm telling this story today not to speak about the rush of adrenaline, though that was there. The story came to mind to me this week as I pondered my parents and their different ways of handling my request for permission to go. So I invite you to hold on to that for a moment as we turn to our scripture text for this morning. The last time we heard from Peter, he was spouting denials about Jesus. Then last week, he has an encounter with grace, quite literally, so I observed. It was a wonderful service last week, and I'd like to thank Rob and others for their work on that, but particularly Rob for his leadership and contributions and presence. Yes. This goes without saying, but your call is unquestioned by anyone who has ever met you, and we are beyond grateful for your ministry, so thank you. We do see Peter receiving grace from grace, or Jesus. And here in today's text, we see him going off and continuing the work of Easter. So I did slip up and say Happy Easter, right? But we are in Eastertide, which is a season of the church. Easter not just being one day. So we see Peter going off, continuing the work of the church, continuing the work of Easter. He encounters a woman named Tabitha. She's also named Dorcas, but let's stick to Tabitha for simplicity's sake, and she has died. Some of the disciples send for Peter. He arrives upon the scene, and it is a scene of mourning. Something happens here that we don't often see in the scriptures. It's a bit of what in the chaplaincy world we used to call life review. We were trained as chaplains to remember that the person who is dying or who has died is not just a patient in the hospital. They are a person. They have a whole life outside of the building in which they are dying. This is a person who had a job, interests, hobbies, personalities, memories, hopefully with those gathered. And it's a wonderful privilege to be able to recall the whole life of that person in that moment of death. We don't really see these life reviews too often in the scriptures, but here in verse 39, we read, all the widows stood beside Peter, weeping, and showing tunics and other clothing that Tabitha had made while she was with them. So this woman was a remarkable seamstress. This is a woman who nurtured those around her with her craft. In a way, we see her here in a motherly role. The story touches Peter. He sends everyone out, kneels down to pray, and then says, Tabitha, get up. And the woman, by God's power working through Peter, is raised from the dead. So we have a story here, and we also have stories underneath the story. The story of Peter, the wishy-washy disciple who denied knowing Jesus, who then is forgiven, internalizes grace, and becomes a truly incredible minister and healer. Stay tuned for more of that next week, by the way. Then we have the story of Tabitha, a mothering soul who gives to all of the women in her community. It says the widows were showing Peter the tunics. Women who were widows were not able to really own wealth at that time. So Tabitha's gifts of clothing might be less business sense and more acts of charity and deep love. Stories underneath the life stories of our characters. Peter's rougher edges softened by the love that came from Jesus, so much so that he channels life-giving power, literal life-giving power. And Tabitha, what's her story? Who taught her how to make clothing? Who taught her about kindness and generosity? How many people had she helped? We have stories underneath the stories. So today is Mother's Day, and as I mentioned, we'll have a litany later in our service this morning, honoring the mothers in our midst, honoring those who have filled a motherly role, and those who have yearned to be mothers, but for whom that has not happened. We are all on different stages of this journey, and we all bring our own stories underneath our own story of motherhood. If Tabitha had had children, the text does not indicate it, but we know that she cared for many in a nurturing sort of way. In my skydiving story, there are also stories underneath the primary story. My dad could be viewed as the hero, and in many ways he was. Dad was never one to say no to an experience. He was a yes guy when it came to trying new things, traveling to new places. My dad had other foibles, but his fears were few and far between. When he died back in 2007 at the age of 58 from cancer, he shared with me that he did so with very few regrets. Age, he said, does not connote a full life. Living life fully does. And his life felt full because of the way he had lived it. I get my sense of adventure from my dad. But why I'm telling this story on Mother's Day is because as much as my dad was the hero of my skydiving adventure, now that I have become a mother, I give my mom a lot of credit for how she handled herself. My parents didn't often work at cross purposes, so my mom had a lot of feelings upon hearing that Dad was going to send me the money after all. In case you couldn't tell, unlike my father, my mom is not fearless, especially where her kids are concerned. I get my adventurous nature from my dad, and I get my sense of caution and thinking through things from my mom. So I give Mom credit here, and not necessarily for her initial no to me, but for knowing when to step back in the decision making. She could have pushed forward with her belief that this was a very bad idea, but she knew enough to change course. She was mature enough to be able to sit with her own feelings and to let her husband and daughter have a good time, albeit in a way that was different than she had truly hoped. My mom sitting with her anxieties and disappointment about things not going her way in this instance shows as much love as my dad's permission giving, if not more. Because of them both, dad's yes and mom's caution but eventual permission, I flew and I fell gracefully, parachute of protection intact. We need both and, don't we? We need a yes and we need a be careful. And we need the parachute of I've got you. Some of us have had this experience with our own parents, and some have not. Again, we are all gathered here bringing who we are, stories underneath the story. Beloved of God, when we are loved by others beyond what we deserve, myself with my parents, Peter with Jesus, Tabitha with those around her, we can soar to new heights. What does that mean for you? On this Mother's Day, who are you honoring in your memory? It may be someone with a blood connection to us. It may be someone whom we adopted. It may be someone who adopted us. It may be someone in your life who has filled that role in a beautiful way. As we continue in this Easter season, who are you being called to say yes to, even if the way sounds pretty crazy? Whom can you help get up? Who needs the parachute of protection? Which words of yours do you need to bridle? Because perhaps while what you want to say is true, anyone who jumps out of an airplane is a little crazy, I know. But perhaps while what you want to say is true, it may not be words that are needed in that moment. A friend of mine who is in a recovery group said to me years ago that the most important thing she has learned in her struggle with alcoholism was that being loving can be more important than being right. Those words have really stayed with me as I work hard to be countercultural in this way, only sharing an unkind word or a criticism when I feel that I have to. So let's play out this story. Jesus technically would have been right to have held Peter's betrayal over his head, but it wouldn't have been loving. And Tabitha probably would not have been resurrected. Stories within stories, each impacting and informing the next. Generations gone by, infusing us, we hope and pray, with love and care, whether they are our parents or no. People impacting others, story after story after story. It is the story of our faith. On this day, may we honor the stories we hold, both those we share and those we keep to ourselves. May we honor our mothers or our motherly figures, like Tabitha, whose stories infused our own with meaning. And may we continue to honor our parent God, mother and father of us all, who saw us before anyone else did, who infused us, each one of us, with a story of deep meaning and deep love. If we work to remember these things, our spirits, and perhaps even our bodies, will get up and rise with new life and soar. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.